We're very excited to be talking with Ray Cronise. Ray is a passionate innovator, disruptor, and scientist. He began his career as a material scientist at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, where he worked for 15 years in physical and analytical chemistry and biophysics. Then he went on to co-found Zero-G, flights that produce weightlessness and approximate spaceflight conditions for purposes of scientific research, cinema, and entertainment. Ray was then written about in Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Body. In that book, Tim Ferriss wrote about Ray's work with cold stress therapy as a tool for fat loss, which he then went to write extensively about. It's called the metabolic winter hypothesis, and we'll be hearing about a lot of it today. But last but not least, Ray is the man behind the amazing weight loss transformation of Penn Jillette. That's Penn from the comedy duo Penn and Teller. Ray guided Penn as he lost more than 100 pounds using a plant-based diet. So thanks for being with us here today, Ray. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
It's really an honor to be speaking with you. I think people are going to learn a lot.
Great. I love it.
All right, so Ray, you have some of the most fascinating views on metabolism that I've ever heard before. And I've been in this game for a long time myself. So there's a lot of topics that I want to cover here today. Let's start with longevity, okay? Can you tell us what the research says about how diet affects longevity?
Yeah, so really when we talk about longevity, there's really two things that we're talking about. One, we're talking about age-related disease, the fact that human beings accumulate age-related disease. So this is cardiovascular disease, cancer, autoimmune diseases, those kinds of things. And at the same time, there's another part of longevity research that deals with really what's called senescence or cellular senescence, which is a pre-programmed thing to die. So let's think of the leaves in the season. The leaves start out, they grow to a certain point, they become green, and then they're designed to die, or they are adapted to die over a certain period of time because, having leaves in the winter when there isn't much sun and there's lots of ice and snow would be detrimental to the plant. So similarly, our cells have a pre-programmed kind of death. Some cells grow too much. We talk about cancer cells that don't know when to die, and we end up accumulating too much of them. So there's this really delicate balance. So when we're talking about longevity, really we're talking about two things at once. One, how can we go in and fix things that need to be fixed on a cellular level so that we don't have to, age prematurely, or we can, extend the actual amount of time we're alive on Earth. I mean, think about it, each cell is just something that we, that has a finite amount of, of things going on. And if we could just keep those going, we could all keep going. And the second thing is really about how do we not accumulate age-related disease? How do we avoid cardiovascular disease? How do we avoid diabetes? How do we avoid the kinds of things that we can do? So really what my focus has been on is generally would be called health span. So my idea is, instead of living longer, I want to live longer. In other words, my focus is on how can I be youthful like I am now? How can I be disease-free? How can I enjoy cognitively functional, ambulatory? How can I enjoy life for as many days, with the idea that I think that in my lifetime, I think in our lifetime, we will start encroaching on that wall that we're going against in terms of the lifespan, and we can actually do that. That will take pharmacological intervention. We're not going to do that eating carrots. Okay, so anybody that thinks that we're going to dramatically lengthen the life of the possible life of a human just with food, there's just too many things to overcome. However, in the health span side, which is what got me started in this, we can significantly lengthen life, the healthy part of life, instead of dying really, really slow. Because that's what we do right now. We're dying earlier, not just in terms of when we ultimately, go lights out, but we begin to die earlier and earlier and earlier, and we just have this slow, painful, expensive kind of death. And I'm saying I'd rather live long and die fast if I have to die. So my original journey really started with weight loss, and I was trying to lose weight. I would be successful. I'd gain it back. Long story short, for me, I was my cholesterol was had gone through the roof. I was basically knocking on type 2 diabetes door. Fasting blood sugar glucose was up. HbA1c was up. I was having reactive hypoglycemia. I had already lost my weight, and if you want to find out, there's a TED Med talk on that, on cold stress, or as you mentioned, Tim Ferriss' book, 4 Hour Body, talks about how I did that by adding cold stress into my life. But what was really interesting is that it wasn't until I switched over to a plant-based diet that I ended up getting rid of those other issues. So I got rid of my diabetes. And what I mean by getting rid of my type 2 diabetes is not just removing dietary carbohydrate, starches, and sugars from my diet. In fact, those becoming the primary part of my diet and my blood glucose becoming normal. If you just remove them, then that's not the same. We can talk about that again in a minute. But, bringing that full circle back to longevity, when I was at TED Med the very first time, I met in line a guy by the name of David Sinclair at Harvard. He is the guy behind resveratrol. He's a leader in longevity research. And I didn't even know who he was at that time. And his badge wasn't labeled. And we started talking. And he kept telling me that this cold stress stuff has a lot more implications beyond weight loss. So I was sort of talking about my weight loss story, but he's like, do you know this is like, that there's this intersection. You ought to really dig deeper because, part of the core TED conferences, TED Med and the real TED conferences beyond the TEDx is about bringing these ideas together and bringing people together to do sort of collaboration. So when I got back, I started looking into it. And, fast forward a number of years, in 2014, he and I, another guy, Andrew Bremer, who's the program director for type 2 diabetes at NIH, we put our first paper out called the Metabolic Winter Hypothesis. And it really said that, hey, this idea of mild cold stress and this idea that I talked about earlier of this dietary restriction, that actually both of them at a sort of a cellular level, at the mitochondria, the plant's power, the cell's power plant, at the mitochondrion level, those actually invoke very similar kinds of biochemistry. And we, hypothesize whether they actually are both, there for the idea of promoting life. So if you think about it, if we live, it takes about 15 years for us to get to reproductive prime. We have about 15 or 20 years of being in reproductive prime, and then we got to raise our last offspring. I've got one graduating this year from high school. We've got to raise them to reproductive prime. So somewhere around 45 or 50, evolution's sort of done with us. I'm not saying there are grandmothers can't help and things like that. I'm saying in terms of passing on your genes. And if you think about the things we're all mostly dealing with, we're mostly dealing with age-related disease that sets in after reproductive prime and raising your offspring is over. And this is a simple story. I'm not trying to quote hardcore science and say it has to be. It's as if it's this way. So it's a good framework to sort of look at the problem and think about the problem, not to say, yeah, this is how we are. But the idea here is it's interesting. It's intriguing to think about the fact that it may be that this accumulation of age-related disease is actually related to a lifetime of chronic overnutrition. So in other words, it's overnutrition. So it's, malnutrition matters, but malnutrition, everybody thinks of malnutrition as not having enough. And 100 years ago, when we were economically limited on food, that may in fact have been the prime issue to overcome. But we don't get scurvy anymore. We're not getting pellagra. We're not getting rickets. We know the diseases of deficiency. And what we're really dying of is diseases of overnourishment. When the person dies of a heart attack and is laying, obese on the table, the fact of the matter is they're probably not deficient in anything. I mean, this, Cyrus is a PhD in nutritional biochemistry. I mean, you can go eat at fast foods and get enough nutrition to make it through that 45, 50, reproduce. I mean, this is not debatable. So this idea that we're hyper-focused on all this healthy eating, all this clean eating, whatever, we actually do really fine from an evolutionary perspective up to that point. Now, if the goal is back to where we started this whole thing about me, my thing on longevity, or as I said, health span, if it's about living longer, meaning spending more of that time healthfully, then of course, now the overnutrition becomes more and more a problem. So we see this in type 2 diabetes, which is clearly related to overnutrition. We see this with cardiovascular disease. Many autoimmune diseases are the same way. I suspect a lot of cancers are the same way. So the idea of my interest in longevity really stemmed out of that.
You talk about in the world of diabetes in particular, you talk about the fact that we use this verbiage about carbs, low carb food, high carb food, carbohydrate this, carbohydrate that. And you fundamentally believe that that's actually the wrong language. So can you go in a little bit more detail about what is wrong with identifying foods as carbohydrate, protein, or fat, and what's a different way to think about it?
Let's take the word carbohydrate, and then I'll show you something as an example. Let's take the word carbohydrate. So crab shells, books, that's the chitin and crab shells, books, cotton, sugar, starches, fruits, these are all carbs. Now, what that means is they all have this defining bond in organic chemistry. And 171 years ago, when William Prout decided that he was going to group foods in this way, we found out that, or we were looking at the basic energy components of food. And so all of those things I just said are isometabolic, and iso means the same, like an isosceles triangle has the same sides, two sides on it. So they're isometabolic. I mean, isocaloric, meaning they have the same amount of calories in them, but they're not isometabolic. Clearly, if you're eating cotton, you are not going to get enough nourishment or enough energy extracted from that to live. On the other hand, the moths that live in your closet do perfectly fine on cotton. Let some go in there and you'll see. If you decide to pick up a book and chow down on the pages, it was a great book. I really ate it up. I promise you, you get a great fiber load, but bookworms that get in there and actually destroy old books actually are getting that glucose. So when someone thinks that a 2x4 and a baked potato are exactly the same thing, that's what I'm talking about. You say, this is a ridiculous thing to be saying. No, it's not, because a 2x4 is just a long chain of glucose with a beta amylase bond in it, and that bond, that bond that it has in it, we don't have a beta 1,4 glycidic bond, not amylase bond, a glycidic bond, and we don't have the enzyme to digest that cellulose in that 2x4. On the other hand, in that starch, the large complicated starches have an alpha 1,4 linkage in them, and that alpha 1,4 linkage, or alpha 1,6 in the case of the starch, has those two. We have an enzyme to design that. Now, termites eat wood, and what they get from that is glucose. Or if we think of a ruminant animal that's eating the fiber that it gets from grass, grass is basically glucose to them. They have bacteria in their rumen that break down those little chains, and they get glucose. So cellulose and starch are fundamentally the same thing. They're chains, complex, polymers of glucose, and glucose is this fundamental fuel. So when we talk about carbs, why is it now, bringing it back, why is it that carbs then presents a problem? Because if I go to any dietary study and I happen to be on the other side of the coin, I'm talking about fats or lipids, another energy source for people, I'm going to put my best plate against your worst plate. And then I'm going to say, see, it's all sugar. The sugar is the problem. And then we're over here, and we're going to put our best whole food, high fiber starches against their fat. And we're going to say, you see, your saturated fat's the problem. And the truth of the matter is, chronic overnutrition on both sides is a problem, and that eliminating either side gets you more down this longevity path. It gets you farther down the path. I happen to believe the plant side gets you the most distance, but that doesn't mean that people who have suddenly changed their diet, say a person has done a paleo diet and they see benefits, there are other reasons why the longevity issues are there, but they see a benefit, and to deny the benefit they see basically has everybody talking past each other. And so I think the only way that happens is when we start organizing foods very loosely as protein, carbs, and fat. Without the word carbohydrate, cotton can never be equated to table sugar or a baked potato or chitin in a crab shell. You have to have that word.
Okay, so you're writing a book called Our Broken Plate, in which you're re-engineering the way that people are going to be thinking about the food that they're eating. So can you teach us what this new system is and why it's a more effective way of thinking about food rather than carbohydrate versus protein versus fat?
Yeah. In fact, let me share screens with you real quick here. All right. So some people see food as fuel. These are the energy things. How many calories are in something? And that is a legitimate way to look at food. It's not the only way to look at food, but it's a legitimate way. And this is what we did 100 years ago or 170 years ago when we were trying to figure out how humans live. What was metabolism? You know, we realized, or Lavoisier going back 200 years, realized that, you know, a flame, a candle burning is the identical chemical process to, in that case, a guinea pig and the heat that that guinea pig was giving off. That the chemical process is not similar, it's the exact same process. So food as fuel is something that's been around for 2 centuries. We've learned more about the biochemistry. This is what you and I studied in school, Cyrus, and the biochemistry. All these, you know, we see it on Facebook posts, we see it on blogs. All these people are experts in these really complex molecular biology and biochemistry. And that whole biophysics is complicated and we don't know it all. But some people see food just in terms of this complex biochemistry. They'll talk about high glycemic foods. They'll talk about essential amino acids. They'll talk about all kinds of things that are that. What I want to do is I want to change the dialogue away from the idea that food is a protein, carbohydrate, or fat. Because the truth of the matter is that all foods are mixtures of them. And when they're not mixtures, they're so highly refined that really they're not food, they're food adulterants. So olive oil is not food. Cane sugar isn't food. Agave syrup isn't food. It's a highly refined adulterant. And you can have all of those things in some amount of quality and not have a problem. So I'm saying let's get rid of all of this and let's put food back where it belongs, back on the plate. This is talk about cauliflower. Talk about, you know, hazelnuts or cashews in this case. Talk about, you know, parsley. Talk about cranberries. Talk about food from a food perspective. You know, where do you get your protein? God, you know, that question is so absolutely fallacious just on the surface. It's kind of a crazy idea, but people really ask it. People really think about it. Or on the other side, saturated fat's going to kill you immediately. I'm not saying that it doesn't contribute to a lot of stuff, but the fact of the matter is you get through a lot of life doing that, and eventually it can catch up. So the idea is we use protein, carbs, and fat when we group foods that way, and we organize them and see them that way. It causes us ultimately we believe, to put more on our plate. It causes us to eat because we think we're going to be deficient in something. So my idea is, you know, obviously if you're eating on a vegan diet, you add those things back, you're going to, you know, create a problem. But my idea is really to get people talking about food again. Talk about asparagus, talk about mushrooms. If you're going to talk about meat, talk about, you know, the meat. The fact of the matter is, stop calling it protein. You know, when I get to a restaurant and it says, choose your protein, it's wrong. And for you to talk about beans have protein and tofu has protein, who cares? No one's dying of a protein deficiency. They really aren't. They aren't. That's not a problem. But by doing it, it legitimizes the debate. And now, is it your protein or my protein? Is it my protein's better or your protein's better? Is it my carbohydrate or your carbohydrate? My fat, your fat. And here we go. And so the fact of the matter is, if protein, carbs, and fat don't exist as words, we actually are forced to go back and talk about food. And if we're forced to talk about food, we're no longer doing studies where the only idea is blinding it. You can do a control or double blind test on a banana if you stick it in the other end. But everybody knows they're eating a banana. And so what they do is we make Franken foods. We make foods where you can't see the difference, where we're changing slight differences of protein, carbs, and fat. And we've been doing this for 150 years or 100 years for sure. And, the fact of the matter is we haven't gotten any closer to what a whole food diet looks like.
Okay, so this is great. So we got to talk about food and the whole thing, and just not worry about the minor stuff. So speaking of an interesting topic where we're not really talking about food, let's talk about water fasting. Can you tell us your experience with that and why that can actually help diabetics?
Yeah, so I probably don't know all the details for the diabetic side because obviously there's some issues with type 1 diabetics. From a type 2 diabetes perspective, think of it generally speaking as an antidote to overnutrition. If chronic overnutrition is what led to type 2 diabetes and the specific mechanisms, we actually have a new paper that's coming out. In fact, yours truly, Cyrus, is going to be co-authoring this with me. But anyway, we have a new paper that comes out that talks about sort of the root of type 2 diabetes and why it might occur. And it basically takes the first two papers and it goes to another level and relates them together. But generally speaking, let's first just talk about fasting in general. So the idea with fasting is, you need air within minutes, water within days, food within, say, 30 or 45 days without taking some kind of vitamin or mineral. The longest medically supervised water fast was 382 days. Lost 277 pounds. But this idea that you're going to go into starvation mode and your body's going to start using your lean mass and it's going to hold on to fat is just crazy talk. And I'm going to tell you, the people that say that don't measure metabolism. They haven't measured it. If they would know that that's not the case. So when we go into a fast, over the first couple of days, we basically burn through our glycogen. Our liver has a storage of glycogen, and that's for your blood glucose. We then switch over to a tertiary fuel. Ketones are produced as sort of an intermediate step for fat metabolism, and those end up having a role in supplying energy. But basically, you're living off of fat during whatever step you want to measure it. Your energy is your fats. And guys, this makes sense. The idea that we're living off of our fat reserves during time of no food is why we have fat reserves. And the concept or idea that you need to eat the fat reserves or the fat storage organ, the energy storage organ of another plant or animal to burn your own storage organ is crazy.
So this is incredible. So I live with type 1 diabetes. Robbie has type 1 diabetes. And you and I have had conversations about this in the past where you said that living with diabetes, especially type 1 diabetes, is actually an opportunity for excellent health. Yeah. I agree with you. Robbie agrees with you. So can you kind of go in a little bit more detail here about what you mean by that?
So when we get a list of things, when the top longevity experts get together and they say, what is the list of things that we can do with our diet to help the health span? What we find that they come up with is fasting and fasting mimicking diets, protein or amino acid restriction, and we won't go into that too much detail, but protein or amino acid restriction, resveratrol, other sort of dietary restriction mimics. You've heard about resveratrol. There's some other ones like that. Decreasing inflammation. And when we look at all of these things, and then the other one, which is the biggie, is a decrease in IGF-1 and growth hormone. So IGF-1, this is insulin-like growth factor. Insulin has more of a role than just shuttling glucose around. It has way more role. And, a lot of bodybuilders abuse it because it puts on muscle mass. So this idea that insulin is just this little locking key that lets glucose into your cells is actually not an accurate picture. It's an okay story to tell, but like protein, carbs, and fat, it causes people to make, poor choices, unintended poor choices. And so when we look at it, minimizing IGF-1 and growth hormone is a really big part of this longevity. And so since this is a really big part of this longevity, you have what I always call, and I always talk about, my friend Cyrus with a hypodermic pancreas. So the difference between me and you is that when I'm getting diabetes, my pancreas could be going crazy and I have no idea. You see, all these people that, do the high fat diets and they think their HbA1c looks great, they're fooling themselves. And here's what I mean by that. If you think when your glucose goes up and down, your body releases insulin, that is true. But it could be true and irrelevant because your body releases insulin for lots of other things too. And what's interesting about you guys is that you're controlling that insulin going in your body. So when you're not getting it, you're not producing any insulin. At least, you guys are far enough along that it's almost insignificant. Some people may have a little bit left. So what that means is that there's a lot of other things that are needing insulin, and you're just using glucose, your glucose level, sort of as a proxy or as a way to say how much insulin I need. Because if glucose is steadily using too much of it and something else is using too much of it, and it's not there for the glucose, you'll see a glucose go up. And in that case, glucose is a really good, when you have a limit to how much insulin you're injecting, glucose is a great way to know whether or not you've injected enough. But glucose is not a good way to know if your pancreas is producing it whenever it needs it. What that shows you is your glucose controlled. It doesn't say whether you need it or not. It doesn't work the other way. And let me say it a different way. If HbA1c and fasting glucose for a type 2 diabetic, for my kind of case, let's just assume these are traffic violations and accidents that a driver would have. And these are biomarkers for a bad driver. So if you get a lot of accidents, HbA1c, you get a lot of tickets, fasting glucose, you're a bad driver, type 2 diabetic, right? And so what a lot of people out there are telling people, and it's really a shame that they're telling people, they're saying, hey, look, let's just, and by the way, what the bad driver means is that your body's not processing dietary carbohydrate properly. So these are biomarkers for a broken or poor dietary carbohydrate metabolism, okay? So now let's take away the car or take away the dietary carbohydrate, and then let's look at our accidents and traffic citations in 6 months. Wow, I got a perfect record. By using the same logic, you would conclude that this person is a great driver. They're now suddenly a driver because you took the car away. And this is just simply not true. And that's what's going on right now. And there's a lot of people might be listening. You may have a great HbA1c. You may have great fasting blood glucose. But if you're not eating dietary starches and sugar, so what? You might still have a broken dietary carbohydrate system. And why does that matter? What matters because the advantages of having proper glucoregulatory control is controlling the insulin, not the glucose. So now I'm bringing it back to why do you guys have an advantage? Because as you guys both know, and most diabetics, and certainly most physicians or many physicians advising diabetics, can't conceive of an idea of increasing the amount of dietary starches and sugars in the diet to the primary energy source and using less insulin. And the reason why they can't is because we have the word diabetes. You're going to see a theme here. Remember what carbohydrate did to cotton and cotton candy? It became metabolically, it looks the same, and it became metabolically equivalent. And we know that's not true. Well, guess what? Type 1 and type 2 diabetes, without the word diabetes, these things really aren't the same. Yes, they both share the symptom of glucose control, right? So they share that symptom, but one is you're not producing the insulin, and in the other case, it's not being used effective with your peripheral tissue. and your muscle tissue and your legs and arms aren't connected to your pancreas. So the fact of the matter is, many of your type 1 diabetic friends are type 2, just like me. They have eaten the same diet I'm eating. They're injecting the insulin and their body's not using it. Well, guess what? Now bring in that longevity work. We're trying to reduce the insulin. We're trying to reduce the IGF-1. We're trying to reduce the growth hormone. And you know what? I can't do it, or I don't know if I'm doing it every day. You guys have a daily record.
Okay, this is really important here. So you started talking about this is really about managing insulin. And so we've talked about this several times with several experts, and this is an important topic. So you can also go on, if you go on a truly low carb diet, you eat less than 30 grams of carbs a day, your total insulin need can be very low.
Sometimes in the beginning, and it may get them there down the road. It may get them there down the road. But a lot of people then, you also have the other side of this, which is the essential amino acids. So now you've controlled glucose or you've controlled insulin, but what about now all the excess methionine in the diet? What about all of it? Because you got to get your food from somewhere. So now you're eating fats and extra amino acids. So now you've got, on the other side of it, you've got excess amino acids in diet. So it's one of those 5 things. If you look at the whole list, it's one of them. And what I'm saying is that an advantage, because that was the question, advantage of type 1 is that you know what your insulin is doing.
Right.
And so the fact of the matter is, for a lot of people, they still could be insulin resistant. And yes, they don't need as much insulin to manage their blood glucose. But at the other side of it, all of the other systems are also using that insulin as well.
Right. And that's something that Cyrus and I emphasize repeatedly, especially for type 2 diabetics, for mainly type 1 diabetics, but also type 2, is it's not a game about trying to get your total insulin secretion as low as possible. That's not the name of the game. We're trying to get to an appropriate amount of insulin for your body, your weight, your activity. That includes type 2s as well. You want to, whatever's going on, to have optimal health, you want to get to appropriate amounts of insulin. But what do you tell people to do?
I have people reduce the fed state of the day. I have people eliminate salt, oil, flours, refined sugars and sweeteners. All those things are rare and appropriate. If they are going to continue to eat animal products, I have that do it very infrequently. And obviously some are worse than the others. I have people, when they want to exercise, I have them exercise, but I have them stop exercising while they're in weight loss.
Ray, put in a plug for yourself. How do the listeners follow you, learn more about you, read your stuff? Do you have social media presence? Put in a plug for yourself.
Obviously, you can find me on Facebook. You can find me at Ray Cronise on Twitter. I have my book that's going to be coming out. I'm finishing now, called Our Broken Plate. If you're following me on any of those now, you'll see when I announce it. I had a Kickstarter, and I backed everything with Kickstarter because I wanted sort of to tell the story I wanted to tell, not necessarily a book that would be a New York Times bestseller. And so when that comes for sale, you'll see those there. I'm launching a program in the next probably 45 to 90 days. It's centered on the kind of weight loss ended, but all of our weight loss is going to be invitation only. So the only way to actually get in is to know someone who's succeeded. So that's called Just Sides, just eating the side dish. It's a plant-based version. The only way to get involved, though, is going to be to know somebody that's actually succeeded with it. So, we really want to start a revolution. I would really love to implement the things I'm doing, but I want to do it in a way that breaks the diet and exercise paradigm. I want to break the way we traditionally are talking about it. I want to get away from, making everything, making someone believe they need a molecular biology degree or a biochemistry degree to shop. I want to get rid of the food label stuff. The best foods don't need labels. And you know what? They don't need expiration dates either, because it's intuitively obvious when you look at it that it's rotten and you probably shouldn't eat it. It just doesn't taste good. So labels don't really help much. It's like really clear. I can tell, that orange doesn't smell good. I'm not going to eat it, and so I want to get people back into the dialogue of talking about food. So anyway, if you're following me, Our Broken Plate will be coming out. Just Sides will be launching at sometime in the next couple of months. Obviously, watch for our papers. Your guys' stuff will be there. So I'll definitely notify if they're signing up and they saw this and you guys have the email. I'll make sure to send announcements out to you guys as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today with us, Ray. I feel like you have so much information and you have a totally different way of presenting it, which I think is fantastic. And I always welcome alternative viewpoints. Not that you're not coming out of left field by any chance. You're just sort of changing the rhetoric and changing the conversation that most people use to describe diet, food, and nutrition. And I think it is fantastic. So thanks for your time today.
And explain it and get to a new level of thinking and disrupt it, not to make it into a business. So that's why I'm attacking this in a different way. I don't care if I'm wrong about stuff. I only learn when I'm wrong. Obviously, you don't learn if you already know something. So I am attacking in a different way. It's I have a whole chapter in a book that talks about the obesity trichotomy. And there's an issue on all three sides, the medical industry, the food industry, and the health and fitness industry. None of them make a lot of money when you're healthy. And that's not that they're evil. They're in business to make money, and that's okay if they do that. The problem is all of our advice is centered on one of those business funnels. And so, what I'm doing isn't going to be the most profitable thing. I'm not going to die a rich man doing the things I'm doing. But I know I can change 10,000 lives, and that's my goal right now. If I can fundamentally change 10,000 lives, like Penn, today's numbers, I think, were 468 people have lost over 22,000 pounds as a result of Penn's book, Presto, coming out. And that's just people changing. All of them on a plant-based diet, none of them about ideology. None of them, none of them paid anybody to do anything. They just started implementing, the kinds of things we see in all of these books. Nobody's fighting over nuts versus oils. No one's fighting over smoothies versus this or organic and GMO. They're just all trying to be a little bit more purposeful, a little bit more present in their meals. And ultimately, every diet works the same way, by restricting swallowing. So you can do that in an operating room, or you can do that in the kitchen. My advice would be to do it in the kitchen, but you know what? Compared to society, I'm the crazy one. And I like being the crazy one. I like to disrupt in that way.